working with lots of different partners. It was a big kind of sector nationwide collaboration, and I'm kind of representing the process and the work, but it was a very broad participatory piece of work with lots of people involved. So Futurice, the Wales Council for Voluntary Action, Third Sector Support Wales, the Future Generations Commissioner, and had some support and input from the Welsh Government and lots of voluntary groups. And I'll be going into sort of introducing the background a bit more as we go. But just a little bit more about my point of view, so you know where I'm coming from, that I actually have a background in sort of human-centered design and future foresight, and I was involved in kind of activism, and through that became a bit skeptical of design and aware of the sort of issues with it. And I'm kind of, over the last few years, been in a process of discovering and transitioning my practice and supporting Futurice to become more systemic. So this piece is focused on sort of a future foresight piece and how that's triggered sort of systemic shifts in the voluntary sector in Wales, and sort of what I've learned along the way. So I'll start with a bit of an introduction, giving you the background, then going into the kind of overview of the process and methodology, and then I'll get into kind of the integral, what came out of it. We created a vision and different outputs, what were the insights, and then a kind of final evaluation. I went back to the client and some key partners kind of 1 year after we sort of stepped away and reduced our role in the project, and did a bit of an evaluation of what was the contribution to system change on different levels. And there's a Q&A, and I've got a bit of an activity in the middle to help sort of absorb the learnings. So one of the one of the key outputs of the project was this Voluntary Sector Futures report, which is completely free to download, and it documents the whole process, the outputs, the strategy that came out of the project, very visual, and it really sums up what we did and where we got to. And this was launched in the spring, so this is a nice sort of recent piece of work to reflect on. And it really captures the main purpose of the work was to create a vision for the future, sort of beyond 2030, about the voluntary sector and society in the whole of Wales. So where does the voluntary sector want to be by 2030? What kind of society do they want? And really manifest the voices of that sort of community of interest. With input from the sort of other sectors as well, to think about how they could collaborate differently in the future. So to set the scene a bit, there were many organisations and participants flowing in and out of the project, but we had a core team, which was myself and Tom from Futurice, and then Suzanne and Anna from the Wales Council for Voluntary Action, who were the core kind of commissioning body. And so our role was to come in and bring sort of methodologies and enhance their process and facilitate this participatory futuring work. And they were sort of behind the scenes, place-based in Wales, connecting all the local stakeholders, doing more relationship building, network weaving behind the scenes, and also sort of setting the agenda, telling us what they needed. So it was a really nice complement of half kind of fresh eyes and half that really place-based insight, and then input from lots of local collaborators. And just a little bit about Futurice, that this is an organisation that's 20 years old and does sort of strategy, futures, design and delivery of technology, and sort of products and services. And we're transitioning to sort of work on more multi-stakeholder projects, become more systemic in the way we work. That's something I'm supporting. But we have bases all across Europe, also specializing in different things. So in Finland, we've got some specialism in sort of circular economy, lots of future foresight going on in Germany, and interesting range of cultures to sort of draw on. So we really aim to bring in these different skills and experiences to help partnerships become more resilient, think more long-term, and in the way they sort of tackle challenges. Just to give an understanding of the client, the Wales Council for Voluntary Action, they are a really big umbrella body, I think the biggest sort of voluntary organisation in Wales, and they're a sort of key leverage point in a way that they connect the public sector, government, key institutional support to charities, volunteers, all the way from sort of micro charity, little unfunded lunch clubs to nationwide organizations like Scouts or Guides. And they are a conduit for education, support, funding, this type of thing. So they were who we were sort of mainly partnering with to sort of lead this project with the other partners. And so they faced a challenge last year that they wanted our support with, and that was they had seen how the voluntary sector had really come into its own in a way in the pandemic, that charities and mutual aid, all these grassroots movements had been an enormous form of leadership and support in this difficult time. And it had really made them think, you know, we don't only want to sort of recover and help society recover as a sector, we want to be more ambitious and think about what's our role in leading to a thriving society and move beyond that. And they had a sort of 5-year strategic review that was prompting them to rethink their whole strategy and what they wanted from the future. And so there's a quote from one of our partners that they were really interested in imagining, not just predicting the future, but thinking about what future do we want, how do we proactively get there, and thinking collectively, how do we get there together? So I thought that was very powerful kind of mindset behind the project, already very forward thinking. And just to give a very brief overview of the scale, that over 50% of charities and sort of voluntary groups in Wales are micro charities, and they have the biggest number of charities and volunteering in the country of all the nations. So there's a lot of really small grassroots organizations, and there's these sort of county voluntary councils that support these different groups. So it's a very kind of dynamic network. And so I thought, okay, we were really aware of the responsibility of the scale of this project, that it is thinking about the voluntary sector nationwide, what do they want from 2030 and beyond? And so we did a lot of different methods to engage and bring in and allow leadership to come from the voluntary sector as a community. And this is just a snapshot of some of the organizations we engaged through interviews, surveys, and fully in sort of hours and days of time of collaborative, hands-on workshop and space to listen and design the future together. So from the grassroots like Race Council Cymru to sort of bigger established ones like Youth Cymru, the Woolwich is a homelessness charity. So just to give an idea of the spread, we've got everything from healthcare to youth representation to sort of creativity. So it was a really dynamic project and lots of different points of view to consider. And so this is just a reference that I thought could be useful when thinking about this work. It was really important to reflect on our positionality, coming in? Do we have the right local place-based leadership? And thinking about, you know, people we're working with, they've really been on the coal face of very difficult traumatic challenges, and the trauma of the pandemic itself, even as you try to dream about a more positive future. So these are some of the sort of mixed methodologies I was drawing on. This idea of really designing with, or having the community kind of lead and design by, rather than designing for or designing at, which is kind of a really nice lead on from this morning, because that's power over, and we're looking at how do we redistribute power, create power with in this process. Sort of using the design justice principles, and this was a brilliant reference for evaluating impact, system change and deep equity, which is all about thinking of how you're amplifying and leveraging kind of local knowledge and really respecting people you work with, and working to ensure outcomes are community controlled and community led. When I talk about futures, a lot of it is based on this kind of theoretical model before I go into the details. So this is called the Futures Cone, and it's sort of to help you think more long term and differently about the future. So traditionally, people have done sort of horizon scanning, trend research, and looked at this end of the cone and this middle section. What do we think is going to happen? Okay, that will probably happen. We're going to react. We're very reactive. And to have more intentional systemic shifts and long-term thinking, we want to look at this end of the cone and think about, okay, we're going to analyze sort of trends and weak signals of what's shifting, but we're going to understand together what is our, you know, what are the range of possible futures, and what's our preferred future? Where do we want to go? And how do we proactively work towards that already today? We're not going to be reactive, we're going to be proactive. And ideally, you want to shift this timeline as far as you can, and sometimes shorter timelines and strategic work, I think, can be act as also a Trojan horse for getting people to think longer term and bringing in other systemic tools. And so just to give an overview, the work we did, it was over 4 or 5 months, and then carrying on, sort of phasing out. But this is kind of a ripple or a chapter in a much longer process of change. And I just wanted to highlight, like, I really think system change, it's not a single hero piece of work. So we were fortunate to be building on work that's come before, and the work is carrying on after with other organizations. So we have the very radical Emerging Futures Fund, which is one of the first national lottery funds to support community-led long-term sort of initiatives. They came in 2020, and from that funding, WCVA won the work to do a sort of community foresight project where they worked with all these grassroots organizations in Wales to develop a sort of community system shifting futures toolkit from the ground up with some specialists and local knowledge, and also develop kind of seeds of change and dreams about the future. And off the back of that, we came in and sort of took this to a national level. So from that really community space to bringing in national partners and thinking more expansively. And then as we stepped away, we ended with initial sort of goals and strategic steps. And WCVA took this forward with the Economics Foundation to turn this into sort of a theory of change and really get into the nitty-gritty of operationalizing the strategy of how to work towards the future. And that's what they're working on at the moment. And so during this process, there's obviously ideas being built that we could build on, networks being woven, kind of trust being developed. So I wanted to highlight the position of this project in the larger kind of context. And this takes me to the process and methodology. Just very quickly, we combined the community toolkit that came out of that early work, which is completely free and online on the WCVA site, with our Futurice toolkit, which brings in methods that help sort of get this to a national level and get both the breadth and depth of sort of insight that we needed to be as representative as possible. And we divided it into these three parts, which I'll sort of explain and go into the insight, starting with scoping and horizon scanning, so looking for weak signals of change, and then scenario building, evaluation, roadmap. So this first piece is about gathering the evidence, both secondary and primary, to understand what other possible futures, what's kind of coming around the corner. And scenario building is all about turning that into more cohesive themes, more cohesive visions of what does that mean for the future, what could it look like, and what do we actually want. And then going into, okay, now we have this future ideal, how do we get there? What's our strategy? So I'll talk you through some of these methods in more detail and kind of key insights. So scoping and horizon scanning involved primary and secondary research, including in-depth interviews from a range of very different perspectives. We had a representative from Race Council Cymru, sort of Scouts, youth representative, someone from a national UK-wide charity. So really digging deep, kind of one-to-one. We had secondary horizon scanning with local sort of place-based people who could guide us. We had a survey to reach as many people in the sector as possible. And then we had hands-on workshops for these last two methods of creating seeds of change and futures wheels that I'll dig into. And just to give a snapshot, we did this all in Miro. So it was all online, distributed, people working remotely in the workshop. The work that came before was in person, but this was kind of pandemic friendly, pandemic safe. And we digitized our toolkits so we could work on these with the stakeholders. And we had a lot of collaborative sessions going through together of, you know, what's our plan? Where do we want to get? When we say we want diverse and inclusive participation, how are we defining that? What does that mean? What's possible in the scope? Sort of aligning objectives, having them initiate where should we be looking for credible trend sources, and they were highlighting things like the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales kind of reports, local articles, newspapers, think tanks that we should be looking to. And gave us indicators of what they thought were the sort of key trends for Wales in the next 10 years. And when I say sort of signals or seeds, I wanted to give some examples. So when we look, we apply the PESTLE model. We're talking to people and researching across these spheres of, you know, what's happening politically, economically, for society, in education, in schools, in technology, in legislation, and from the environmental perspective. And I'm thinking more and more about ways of how do we represent nature and the environment in this process of thinking about the future. And so this is an example of signals that we've seen, and it's sort of moving towards a trend. We've seen a lot coming out about the well-being economy and donor economics, and in Wales, there's a Wellbeing Economy Alliance, kind of a smaller voluntary group that's growing, that connects Finland and Iceland and Wales to think about the wellbeing economy. So we were sort of collating and clustering these signals into themes and identifying what's most relevant and shifting through those. And then when we had those clusters, both direct and kind of secondary, we collaborated with participants from across the sector and out of the sector to transform them into seeds of change. So seeds of change are more participant led, saying, you know, if we took these clusters that are kind of pointing towards a more positive or preferred future, or which are your more preferred futures, and then what would happen in 10 years if they expanded, if they grew. And we were really looking at initiatives and innovations that are already happening as a guide, and kind of, but really niche. So there's some really brilliant things happening, like the Wheel Collective. So what if we focused on those good things and expanded them and enhanced them, that kind of thinking. And so this is an example in the back is kind of what the workshop looked like. We had all these seeds of change across the different spheres, and we're discussing them, building new ones together, prioritizing. And this is just an example of describing a seed of change. So taking a trend or weak signal cluster and saying, what does it look like in 10 years if that expanded, if we worked on it? So for example, Wales in 10 years has a well-being economy. Well-being is the measure of the nation's success rather than GDP. This is the start of a progressive national identity and global partnership of like-minded nations. And so a very popular seed with some. During this process, the workshops really became a space for listening, and people in the sort of established institutions who had more power, really hearing from voices and people that they'd never encountered or not sort of talked to directly before. And it was really a privilege to hear the incredible visions that people had. And I was really impressed by how the people closest to the challenges had this incredible imagination to unleash about what they wanted, how to resolve those challenges, what their ideal future would look like. And you could see from what they want in the future, what are the issues people are fighting against today. So it's very revealing to backtrack. So this was one a lot of people resonated with. Active citizens would be helping each other, random acts of kindness would be happening, everyone would have an equal voice. And there were also things coming up, especially from the grassroots, which the sort of leadership and power holders was potentially uncomfortable, a lot of sort of creative tension, different opinions about the future. So something really important is sort of to facilitate this with a lot of care and awareness. But it was really amazing how passionate and how honest people were. And so there was frustration that these leadership organizations were setting agendas and were not necessarily representative of the communities that they were serving. And people were wanting to have more of a voice at the table who hadn't been previously included. And so one of the key insights we shared that really created ripples and fed into, I think, more systemic shifts, strategic shifts for the organization was this insight that we started mapping out. So this was the picture of the main, or one of the main challenges we wanted to bring to the fore in this work and rethink in the futures, which was you have this voluntary sector, lots of small to medium micro organizations supported by these established institutions. Obviously, it's very simplified. So the public sector, NHS might connect people to local voluntary organizations. The Future Generations Commissioner is holding the public sector accountable for thinking about well-being, lots of different networking going on. But we had these sort of grassroots organizations and micro charities and organizations who were not represented in institutions, who were often sort of traditionally marginalized identities, were really struggling to get the same access to funding. A lot of the funding they felt was being channeled to very established organizations, which had more of the sort of majority, or see some laughing and nodding in the audience, And obviously this isn't new, you know, people on the ground like know this, but it's kind of, this was sort of became a channel to communicate to the decision makers. And so we created a huge number of seed of change, a lot more than I anticipated, which responded to, you know, what would people like to see instead? How do they want to change this? And I think this is one of the key ones that came out of that kind of frustration, that the grassroots organizations in 10 years, they imagine they would be highly valued for their close connection to different communities. They're the ones that know the challenges the best, that are supporting on the ground, and they form a bridge with the larger institutions. There's high mutual trust, key decisions are made in partnership, and diverse points of view are influential right from the start. So we tried to keep these seeds as sort of close to the original people's voices in the workshop. And we have examples of where is this happening already. And we turned these seeds, so all in the report, into a sort of open source repository of future imaginaries. And this is something I'm really interested in, is we have a small number of sort of technocentric billionaires and sort of dominant groups really monopolizing the future in their visions, in what they're releasing into the world. And I think it's so important that those people for whom the current paradigm is not working are voicing the future, creating the future, showing alternatives, because everyone gets sucked into kind of mainstream and sometimes very dystopian narratives, but those are not the only possibilities. So yeah, these are all open source, and it's the idea that by capturing them, we're not erasing anyone's future. We're saying, you know, we want a future where many different things are able to flourish, and different sort of points of view. So I want to have a very short, a little bit behind time, but a short breakout where you can turn to the person next to you, and I'll give you sort of 4 minutes, 2 minutes each. If you can think about a seed of change, a positive seed of change that could affect your organization or community, what is it? And if it grew in 10 years in the best way, how could it affect your community? And I've just got some examples along the bottom, like there's a food action plan in local councils that's quite radical in Wales for growing sustainably and local growing and food distribution. Zero Racism Wales, we spoke to in the project, and they were asking citizens and organizations to pledge to eliminate racism in their organizations. So what if everyone in Wales pledged, you know, what could that future look like? LGBT Cymru was a new youth-led independent magazine by and for the LGBT community. So they're just some examples of seeds and initiatives that are happening now that people felt were kind of positive. So yeah, I'll give you 4 minutes, 2 minutes each before we carry on, if you'd like to share with your neighbour. Positive seed of change. It could be an article, an initiative, or you can be in a 3 if that makes sense. So if you can swap partners if anyone hasn't spoken yet. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop you there. Sorry, I know this is not much time, but I'm a little bit short. I'm wondering if maybe one person would like to share something inspiring or their kind of seed or vision. Oh, being volunteered, Scott, if you want to.
I was just talking about one of the things I took yesterday. It's not really I'm working with a children's community in Wall's End who are trying to find funding in a year, but they're trying to find funding of very specific niche funding. But one of the things I took from Indy's conversation yesterday is if you could get funding for the system that supports children and have them be the facilitator of that system, so then you might be able to get funding from health, education, local government.
I love that. Yeah, that's a really nice example. If it could be possible in 10 years. Yeah. Yeah, so it's really interesting thinking about how to water and grow those seeds. What would that mean? So this brings me to the second stage. And this was one of the, I would say the biggest, richest activities was making those seeds of change really valuable activity, if it's interesting to anyone. And then we took those forwards and turned them into sort of statements using the 3 horizons model to kind of backcast how do we get from where we are to where we want to be, creating a more cohesive vision. And the idea is for the one vision to act as a bit of a North Star that can the whole sector can kind of orient towards, but it's one that really embraces difference and nuance rather than being a sort of rigid singular vision. So this is just a bit of a behind the scenes. You can't read anything, but it's to give a picture of what the workshop looked like, that we sort of clustered those seeds into higher level themes and came up with 10 different themes and got place-based, the core team to sort of write those up in language appropriate for the audience, thinking about the language they'd used. And we had many rounds of sort of still collaborating and bringing in different voices to review this vision and sort of develop it. So this is a bit of a picture of, you know, additional feedback and post-its we got to continue to refine this vision in a collaborative way. And we came up with 10 themes, which are in the report, and they all looked at different parts of society that were important to this audience. And this is one example. So by 2030, we want the parks and buildings we enjoy, the skills we share, our stories and cultures, that we're in a place we can pool all these together to make a neighborhood where everyone belongs. We design and deliver our essential services in close teamwork with the government, public and private sectors. And I won't read it out, but you get the idea. So these themes are kind of higher level, a little bit more abstract. And the idea is to combine them with the seeds of change, which provide more nuance and specificity So this is kind of guiding, but open to interpretation. And this was the visual we had, the sort of 10 themes of different areas, and it's overlaid on the vision for the future provided by the Future Generations Commissioner. And they've also done their visioning work that we were looking to and referencing with a lot of engagement and kind of trying to build on that to create this picture. And there's a beautiful quote from one of the core team members on the inside that they were saying, you know, even before we reach the strategic stage, it's just saying the words together with all these different people and voices who've never met, you know, they're building relationships, building connections, building trust. And it was already starting to build kind of excitement and commitment and kind of initial pledges and the common shared will to work collectively from today towards that future. So just a reminder that the vision, it's a little bit like the system mapping. You could go off on your own and do a nice picture of the vision. It's about the whole process of making sure that it's the community or the voice you're looking to understand that's leading, and the participation and people feeling heard and empowered. And that leads me on to phase 3. So once we had the vision, it was about turning that into action ideas. How do we get there? What can we do? What's our kind of plan? And for this, we used the 3 horizons, and we had workshops around this, which was very effective method as well. So we put the themes split into groups and put the future themes here, saying the horizon 3. These things are kind of niche, innovative seeds today. We want them to grow into this future. What does that look and feel like? What are the values? Kind of exploring that. Going back to horizon 1, mapping out where are we today? What are the kind of obstacles? And then horizon 2 is, I think of as the bridge. So how do we overcome those obstacles in the way of that future? How do we work together? What can we do? What's blocking us? And from that came 6 areas that the voluntary sector participants wanted to take action together as a sort of collective. And these are again written out in more specificity, but they included overcoming the digital divide, that there's a lot of exclusion, lack of digital literacy that they wanted to overcome, redefining success, so going a bit back to success being in communities, in well-being, moving beyond GDP, strengthening collaboration in the sector and beyond, and recognition of its leadership, of its strength, moving away from being considered the third sector to a real partner to government, one that's in touch with what people need and led by people on the ground, co-delivering community-centric services, empowering communities to be self-sufficient, and building on what worked in the pandemic, that despite the challenges, the voluntary sector was given more ability to move quickly and had some successes in supporting. So our next activity, again, no need to read this, but more workshops to say, okay, this is the like Wales Council for Voluntary Action vision and mission, and this is what the community has said it wants to do. It wants from the future actions it wants to take. So how do we bring these together and say, what is the role of WCVA as this umbrella organization in supporting those actions, in empowering the sector to make those changes? And so we translated into sort of goals and strategies that were about WCVA specifically. So going from that community action and vision to this single organization strategy. And they also realized in the process they needed to develop their own sort of internal goals, and were sort of challenging their positionality and their role, as well as looking at what the community wanted. And so just a sneak peek that this is all collated into the report, the vision statements and the process. And this is where we sort of stepped back once we'd sort of delivered those strategic goals, and they were taken forward with the New Economics Foundation, and we're kind of staying in touch. And so some key learnings to share that, yeah, not everything went smoothly, things emerged, challenges came up, of course, and I think these are really valuable lessons if you're interested in doing this kind of work. That we had quite a slow start, even though there'd been work done before, because the organisations weren't as representative as they'd like to be as the communities they serve. It takes time to weave networks, engage sort of critical friends, and build that trust. And I think this links to sort of living into those future values, kind of the system change being about the way you are, the process, the way you work, that we aim to sort of work at the pace of trust and care. This is very emotional work, and rushing it can be, you know, very difficult and problematic. And I don't think we always achieve this, but it's something I really try to embed into the work, a sense of care and respect. And so building on that, do anticipate with this work, you know, vulnerability, creative tensions, people having very different opinions. So do set boundaries, look after yourself in the work. It's quite emotional. And something I rely on is sort of trauma-informed or trauma-responsive facilitation is really good to help you think about how do we look after people and not create more trauma in the work. So for example, if people in this process feel used or are over-researched and haven't seen results, that can create negative attitudes and cause damage. So again, awareness of positionality, context, what's been done, and making sure people have, actually this is my last point, and one of the ways to mitigate that is really thinking about mutual learning and trust building and value exchange. So everyone who's participating, are they getting equal value to the people doing the research? In what ways, what makes sense for them? And one of the reasons I was concerned with human-centered design is it has a history of this colonial extractive approach sort of going into communities and extracting knowledge, not necessarily compensating people. So it's really thinking about system changes, moving away from that extractive sort of colonial history and way of working. Oh yeah, and the last piece was really thinking about we're co-designing a world where many worlds fit. I'm sort of paraphrasing some activists and Arturo Escobar. So that's saying, you know, we have a history of traditionally marginalized voices being erased from this kind of work, not being represented. So we need to make sure that that doesn't happen, that those benefiting from the current paradigm aren't leading and defining the work, because they may replicate again those paradigms that they're already benefiting from. So that's always a tension and a challenge, because we've all internalized and the systems are so pervasive, obviously, that we're trying to overcome. So I think it's something you need to reflecting on as a team, making sure you're getting feedback and responding to emergence. So there were times when this was quite a structured process with the aim to create liberation in the workshops, that people felt psychologically safe and kind of knew what was coming. But there were times when we realized it was too much structure and we needed to let go and let a little bit of and let the leadership shift. So that was yeah, again, don't tie yourself to the process too closely, be willing to let go. And finally, the sort of concluding chapter on I went back to the partner after the project. It's kind of a year on, and reflected together, you know, what's been the impact compared to our original intention and maybe emergent sort of contributions or shifts we didn't expect. And I used one of the images I showed earlier, this framework by Cheryl Petty and Mark Leach, where they analyze system change on 4 levels. And I used that to evaluate the work and its value: individual, interpersonal, organizational, and strategic or systemic. And it's a fantastic document that they've created if you're interested. And I sort of took that theory and made this framework. So what we saw, the feedback we got was there's been a shift in mental models about member relations. So the organizations, the Third Sector Support Network, WCVA, they were seeing members not as this external group, but more internal as part of the organization. So it's what was spoken to earlier, shifting the relationship, the relationality, the perception, which is really important for how they relate in the work and progression to kind of members. Individually, this work gave a lot of space that people never have when they're focused on the nitty-gritty and urgent challenges, to actually like process the pandemic and its impacts and what we can do to move forward. So that was really valuable. On an interpersonal level, the having that space for listening to different voices helped shift the power and gave the sort of people on the ground more leadership. And we heard that WCVA and TSSW were really taking on board what members value, what they wanted, what had come out of the vision, and really embedding it. On an organizational level, there was a lot of mutual learning across the organization, more room for feedback also for employees at different levels. There was a sense of higher transparency, that people sort of outside the organization maybe had more understanding of how it worked and felt more able to contribute. And so importantly, it did meet that original goal that directly fed into their strategic goals and actions. So for example, resilience and diversity from past research and different key sort of key themes from the vision and community actions were centered in their strategic goals in a way that they hadn't been discussed necessarily before the work and wouldn't have been otherwise. And finally, sort of strategic and systemic. So the strategic refresh, it has a nationwide impact because TSSW, it's linked to the county voluntary councils across every sort of county in Wales. They are presented with this strategy and need to kind of agree on it. It's what everyone's sort of aligning around. It's dictating the sort of also influencing the business model and funding model of WCVA for the next years. And I understood that people were really happy that this county voluntary councils agreed to this new strategy much more rapidly than in the past. In past years, there'd been a lot of tension and more disagreement, and it was because they felt it more represented their views. They felt heard. They saw what they wanted in that strategy because of the work. So it really shows how going slow, being very inclusive, very collaborative, it can be a challenge to sell in a way, because people always want to move quickly and get to action. But by going slower in that initial stage, you can go more quickly later on because people are more aligned and feel heard. And so these are some of the benefits of this sort of futures-led system change, if you will, which contribute to culture change and systemic shifts, I think, in any organization where they're applied. So not only was there insight and action for the future, it was translated into action and goals today, and it's already influencing and impacting the organization today. So just for example, one thing that came out of the more specific work was that when thinking about funding and business models, they integrated flexibility into the funding so that in the future, if the community says, actually, this funding that was specified, that's not what we need, there's been a different crisis, the community needs something else, they can feed that back and there's flexibility built into the funding. So this futures work supports that sort of flexible mindset today, this appreciation that things can change and people's needs change. And again, we were introducing this very creative participatory culture into the organization, and it's also about capacity building. They already had done some futures work. We're enhancing that, bringing new methods, introducing them to Miro and different tools, and working side by side to really embed the knowledge, not being in a black box and taking things away, but really working in partnership. And perhaps most importantly, by really thinking carefully about inclusion, care and representation, you know, the paradigms we're living into in our work become expressed in the outcomes. So by doing that, you're going to have more equitable, sort of just oriented, inclusive futures where people feel heard, because that's how you've enacted the process. So I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over time, but if anyone is okay to stay a little bit longer and has questions, you're very welcome. So yeah, I'm always really happy and passionate to talk about this kind of work. If anyone wants to contact me afterwards or chat to me in the break, feel free. And again, just to highlight, it was really multi-sector, multi-partnership. Yeah, you can download the report, you can get the toolkits online and experiment yourself if you'd like to. So I'll open it to questions. We work with them on the project. By that work. I'm just wondering, this is a national level strategy, and so whether this could be replicable or not, because it feels like, how it feels really big for England, and also is perhaps not as friendly. Obviously, I've worked with Wales before, and I know there is a lot of relationship there, so that becomes pretty easier, and also because it's more, so whether it's hopeless to think about it at these big levels, whether it needs to be regions instead. I'm just wondering how big it can be with Western people. And because we had a conversation about the health service in the US as well, which is massive. Nice. Really good question. And we had someone from SCVO participate in Three Horizons workshop. It was really interesting because it was also outward looking at how the sector collaborates. I definitely think the process is replicable and the methods. I think you've got a really good gut instinct about, you need to think carefully about the scale, and I would say regional is a good instinct. There is always a risk that I was very conscious of when you try to create one cohesive North Star. The value is people can align and orient. The risk is people feel excluded or unrepresented, or one voice kind of dominates. And it is much easier to, not much easier, it's still, but easier to mitigate to some extent in Wales, that it's quite a close-knit kind of, I'm still very diverse, but smaller population. Yeah, I think it would be a question of, thinking about the budget and scope, what's manageable. I think there's ways to reduce or expand. You could have some caveats that obviously participation, it is, you need to think about what's in scope. So I would have liked to include even more voices, even more points of view, because we're really talking about such a big community. But I think it still has a lot of value, and you can aim to sort of represent and think about different methods to make an appropriate approach for that. Sure. So there was a chapter of work directly with communities, small grassroots organisations on the ground that was in person that I wasn't involved in, but that led to the toolkit. But at the national, that was before the pandemic, exactly. But this was last year, 2021, still a lot of pandemic caution. It was online. We did talk about going in person, but it wasn't necessarily going to make it more inclusive, because there are a lot of people in like North Wales, for example, where it's easier to get from London to Cardiff than or where I'm in Sheffield, parts of Wales, than from North Wales to get to South Wales. So we were able to have really rural sort of community inclusion. And I think it could be really interesting to do a hybrid model that you can do it online. I need to think about how to make that inclusive. And it didn't make sense for us to do it in person at the time, but I think it's definitely possible that you could mix and reflect on what makes sense.
Okay, great. She's probably
Sorry.
No
worries.
It's okay. I have some questions too.
Oh no. Yeah, if anyone wants to speak to me in the break, please do.
No,
Sorry.
super. Thanks a lot for that. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Listening.